We like to believe we are living at the peak of human achievement. We look around us and see a world shaped by machines, by systems so large, so complex, that they seem impossible without modern science. We dig miles into the earth. We cut mountains open. We move tens of thousands of tons of rock, steel, and ore every single day. We build aircraft that cross oceans in hours. We send millions of people into the sky, safely, routinely, without thinking twice. We launch rockets that break free from gravity itself, machines that leave the planet, machines that carry human beings beyond the atmosphere, into a place our ancestors could only imagine. This is the story we tell ourselves, that we are the most advanced civilization that has ever existed, that progress is linear, that knowledge accumulates slowly, step by step, generation by generation. Stone tools, bronze, iron, steam, electricity, computers, spaceflight. A clean, comfortable timeline. And according to that story, everything before us was simpler, cruder, less capable. Ancient people, we are told, lived close to nature. They hunted, they farmed. They worshipped gods they did not understand. They lacked science. They lacked engineering. They lacked technology. At least, that's what we are taught. But history is not always as orderly as we want it to be. Because when we slow down, when we look closely, when we stop assuming that the past must be primitive simply because it is old, we begin to notice something unsettling. There are objects in museums around the world that do not fit the story. Artifacts that appear too precise, too sophisticated, too intentional. Objects that raise uncomfortable questions. Not questions about myth, not questions about symbolism, but questions about engineering, about physics, about design. Questions like, why would an ancient culture carve stone with a level of accuracy that challenges modern tools? Why would they design forms that obey aerodynamic principles thousands of years before flight was supposed to exist? Why do some ancient constructions use materials and techniques that remain unexplained even today? These are not fringe curiosities, they are real objects, cataloged, measured, studied, and yet often quietly ignored. Because they do not belong in the past we think we know. Consider this for a moment. If we discovered a device today that clearly predated modern engineering, but performed according to the same physical principles we use now, we wouldn't dismiss it. We would investigate it. We would ask who built it, how they built it, and most importantly, what they understood that we don't. But when similar questions arise about the ancient world, we often do something different. We explain them away. We call them ceremonial, symbolic, religious. We assume coincidence. Because the alternative is uncomfortable. The alternative suggests that our timeline may be incomplete, that human history may not be a simple upward climb from ignorance to enlightenment, that knowledge can be lost, that entire systems of understanding can disappear. Civilizations rise, civilizations fall, and sometimes they take their secrets with them. Throughout history, there have been advanced societies that vanished almost completely. No gradual decline, no clear explanation, just silence. The Maya, the Indus Valley, the ancestral Pueblones, ancient Egypt after its golden age, each left behind monuments, artifacts, clues, but not instructions. And without context, we project our assumptions onto them. We assume they must have struggled with limitations we struggle with today. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if some ancient cultures understood aspects of physics, materials, and energy in ways that do not survive in written form? What if certain technologies were never meant to last, only to function? Because stone remembers longer than machines. And history favors what survives, not what was most important. Imagine a future civilization discovering fragments of our world. Concrete foundations, steel skeletons, broken circuits. Without manuals, without databases, without electricity. How would they interpret our technology? Would they understand satellites? Jet engines? Nuclear reactors? Or would they call them temples? Ritual objects? Symbols of belief? The truth is, context is fragile. And once it's gone, interpretation replaces understanding. This is where the story begins to fracture. Because across the ancient world, from Egypt to South America, from India to the Middle East, there are artifacts that seem to preserve knowledge. Without explaining it, they hint at principles we recognize today. Lift, balance, resonance, energy transfer, not as equations, but as form, as structure, as function. And when modern researchers recreate some of these forms, scale them up, test them under real-world conditions, they behave exactly as physics predicts, not ancient physics, modern physics. That raises a difficult question. Were these designs accidental? Or were they intentional? Coincidence can explain one anomaly, but repetition demands a closer look. Because these artifacts do not appear in isolation, they appear across continents, across cultures, across thousands of miles and thousands of years. Civilizations that, according to mainstream history, never contacted one another. Yet they left behind objects that follow the same underlying principles. This does not mean they shared blueprints, but it may mean they shared knowledge, or discovered the same truths independently. Either possibility challenges what we think we know, and here's where the discomfort deepens. If advanced understanding existed before, where did it come from? Was it the result of human innovation, now forgotten? Was it inherited knowledge, passed down from an even earlier civilization? Or was it something else entirely? We are not claiming answers. Not yet. But we cannot ignore the questions. Because history is not just about dates and names. It is about capability. What humans were able to do, what they understood, and what they lost. The modern world depends on the assumption that progress only moves forward, that every generation knows more than the last. But history offers no such guarantee. Empires collapse. Libraries burn. Languages disappear. And when they do, knowledge does not politely wait to be rediscovered. It vanishes. Sometimes forever. So when we encounter artifacts that seem out of place in time, the question is not whether they threaten our understanding of history. The question is whether our understanding of history is strong enough to face them. Because some objects don't belong where we find them. Not according to the timeline we were taught, and once you see them, once you recognize the patterns, it becomes impossible to unsee them. This series is not about rewriting history. It is about questioning it, carefully, relentlessly, because the past may not be as distant as we think. And the line between ancient and advanced may be thinner than we ever imagined. Some artifacts don't belong in the past we think we know. And this is where the investigation begins. The first cracks in history rarely appear as grand revelations. They appear quietly, behind glass, on museum shelves. Objects labeled, cataloged, and filed away as solved. At first glance, they seem harmless, small, unassuming. But history doesn't break all at once. It fractures, one detail at a time. Our investigation begins not with legends or myths, but with two physical objects, two artifacts, from opposite sides of the world. Separated by oceans, separated by cultures, separated by thousands of years, and yet bound by something deeply unsettling. The first rests in Egypt. A small wooden object, discovered in the late 19th century. inside a tomb near the ancient city of Saqqara. At the time, Egypt was yielding artifacts at an unprecedented rate: statues, reliefs, tools, models. This object was catalogued as just that, a model. Museum records described it simply as a stylized bird. It was carved from wood, lightweight, weathered by time. It had a beak. It had eyes. And so, for decades, no one questioned it. It was placed among other animal figurines, labeled, stored, forgotten. But sometimes, the problem is not what we see. It's what we assume we're looking at. Nearly 80 years later, an aeronautical engineer studying ancient artifacts noticed something unusual. Not the head, not the body, the wings. They were wrong. Bird wings curve and taper in specific ways dictated by biology. Feathers overlap. Bone structures flex. This object had none of that. Instead, the wings were thick near the body and gradually thinner toward the edges. Exactly where lift is maximized. Exactly how modern airfoils are designed. There was no randomness here. No decorative flourish. The proportions were precise. Even more troubling, the object had something birds do not possess: a vertical tail. A stabilizer. Birds rely on flexible feathers and muscle control. They do not need rudders. Aircraft do. This was not artistic exaggeration. It was functional design. At this point, skepticism took over. Skepticism is essential. Extraordinary claims demand restraint, not excitement. So researchers did what scientists always do. They tested it. The model was scaled up, adjusted only where absolutely necessary to compensate for material strength. No engines, no propulsion, just physics. When placed in controlled airflow conditions, the results were immediate. The object generated lift, stable lift, not briefly, not erratically, but cleanly, predictably. It behaved like a glider. A well-designed glider. This alone did not rewrite history. One artifact can always be explained away. Perhaps it was coincidence, perhaps an intuitive design, perhaps an isolated anomaly. But coincidence has a problem. It doesn't like repetition. Thousands of miles away, on an entirely different continent, another set of objects waited quietly for attention. In Colombia, deep within burial sites dating back over 1,000 years, archaeologists uncovered small gold figurines. They were beautifully crafted, highly detailed. At first glance, they appeared to represent animals, insects, fish. This interpretation was convenient. Nature is a common motif in ancient art. But convenience is not evidence. When examined closely, many of these figurines presented features that biology could not explain. Wings placed where no insect has wings. Rigid triangular forms instead of flexible membranes. Vertical tail fins. Symmetry that defied organic evolution. These objects did not resemble birds. They did not resemble insects. They resembled machines. More specifically, they resembled aircraft, not symbolic aircraft. Not abstract representations, functional ones. The kind designed to move through air efficiently. Again, skepticism was necessary. Ancient people created stylized art. They exaggerated forms. But exaggeration follows cultural patterns. Aerodynamics follows physics. To test the idea, engineers reconstructed these objects at larger scales. As before, no engines were added initially. No modern enhancements, just faithful reproductions. When tested, the results echoed the Egyptian case: lift, stability, control. Some models even demonstrated gliding paths comparable to early 20th century aircraft prototypes. At this point, coincidence became harder to defend. 2 continents, 2 cultures, 2 eras. The odds of independent artistic coincidence following identical aerodynamic principles are extremely low. This does not mean these cultures shared blueprints. It does not require global contact. Physics does not care about borders. But it does raise a critical question. How did ancient people arrive at designs that align so closely with principles formalized only millennia later? Aerodynamics is not intuitive. Lift is not obvious. Humans spent centuries failing to achieve controlled flight. Early experiments ended in disaster. And yet here we have objects that behave correctly on the first attempt, not accidentally. Not approximately, but precisely. Some argue these were toys. Others suggest ceremonial objects. But toys do not require functional optimization. Ceremony does not demand stability and lift ratios. Function leaves fingerprints. And these fingerprints are unmistakable. What makes these cases particularly unsettling is what they are not. They are not monumental structures meant to inspire awe. They are small, portable, personal. Objects meant to be held, studied, perhaps used. They suggest experimentation. They suggest testing. They suggest understanding. Not mastery of flight as we know it, but awareness of the principles governing it. At this stage, history begins to feel less solid. Because if ancient cultures understood aspects of aerodynamics, what else did they understand? Knowledge rarely exists in isolation. Understanding lift implies understanding balance, weight, material properties. And material science is not accidental. The wooden artifact was crafted with a density appropriate for flight. The gold figurines were shaped with symmetry that prioritized stability. This is applied knowledge, not decorative coincidence. Mainstream archaeology often avoids these discussions, not out of malice, but because they complicate narratives. History prefers continuity, clear progressions. These artifacts suggest discontinuity, moments where knowledge appears and disappears. There is no written manual explaining these objects, no texts describing flight experiments, which leads to another uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps these objects were not inventions, but representations, models of something observed, seen in the sky, controlled by someone else. This does not require speculation beyond the evidence. Humans model what they see. Children draw airplanes long before understanding engineering. Ancient cultures depicted chariots, animals, weapons. Why not machines they witnessed? This interpretation remains controversial, but it is not irrational, especially when similar motifs appear across civilizations that never interacted. Again, we are not claiming answers. We are observing patterns. Patterns that resist simple dismissal. Coincidence explains one artifact. Repetition demands a different explanation. At this point, the question is no longer whether these objects are strange. The question is why we are uncomfortable acknowledging their implications. Because they force us to confront a possibility we rarely consider. That ancient humans were not merely passive observers of nature. That they may have possessed, inherited, or encountered knowledge that did not survive them. History, after all, is written by survivors, not by the most advanced. Entire technological traditions can vanish if they are not institutionalized, if they rely on specialists or elites, or external influences. A single generation can erase centuries of progress, and what remains is stone, wood, gold. Silent objects waiting to be misunderstood. These artifacts do not scream their purpose. They whisper, and whispers are easy to ignore. But when those whispers repeat, from Egypt to South America, they begin to sound less like coincidence and more like memory. Memory without context, memory without explanation. Memory fossilized into form. As we move forward, we must resist the urge to leap to conclusions. But we must also resist the comfort of dismissal, because history does not owe us simplicity. And the past does not exist to make us feel superior. It exists to be understood. The first cracks have appeared, not in stone, not in wood, not in gold, but in our assumptions. And once those assumptions begin to fracture, there is no easy way to put them back together. This is only the beginning. Because the deeper we look, the less certain history becomes. When ancient civilizations described their gods, they were not writing science textbooks, they were recording experiences. Stories passed down through generations, preserved in language, metaphor, and belief. To modern readers, these accounts often feel symbolic, mythological, poetic, but sometimes they feel something else. Sometimes the descriptions sound uncomfortably mechanical, not because ancient people understood technology, but because they were trying to describe something they did not. Across cultures, across continents, and across thousands of years, similar patterns appear in religious texts. Patterns that raise a difficult question. What if mythology is not fiction, but interpretation? What if ancient texts are not explaining how things worked, but recording what was seen, felt, and heard? Stripped of metaphor, some of these accounts begin to read less like theology and more like raw data. One of the most detailed examples comes from ancient India. In Sanskrit texts written thousands of years ago, there are repeated references to flying machines known as vimanas. The word itself does not mean God or spirit. It means vehicle. These texts describe vimanas as objects that moved freely through the air, that could ascend vertically, hover, travel long distances. They were not described as living beings. They were constructed, built from specific materials, operated by trained individuals, fueled by defined sources of energy. Some texts describe multiple types of vimanas, different sizes, different capabilities. This is not how mythology usually works. Myth compresses detail, it simplifies. But these accounts do the opposite. They expand. They include operational characteristics. For example, several passages describe loud roaring sounds when vimanas took flight. Animals fleeing in panic, trees bending, dust and debris thrown outward. These are not symbolic elements, they are physical effects. Effects that align disturbingly well with what we would expect from powerful propulsion systems. Other passages describe intense heat, blinding light, turbulence in the air. Again, not divine glow, not spiritual metaphor, environmental disruption. The texts go further. They describe interiors, seats, controls. They describe pilots, not gods steering with thought or magic, but trained operators, individuals who learned how to fly these machines. Some passages even describe failures, malfunctions, crashes. This is important. Gods in mythology do not crash, machines do. Skeptics often argue that these are imaginative stories, poetic exaggerations, and skepticism is healthy. But imagination has limits. It tends to reflect the world of the storyteller. Ancient people imagined animals they knew, weapons they used, storms they feared, but flight, controlled flight, powered flight. That was not part of their daily reality. And yet the descriptions persist, detailed, consistent, persistent across centuries. More unsettling still are the technical details. Some texts describe energy systems involving spinning components, circulation, rotational motion. They describe mercury-like substances used in containment systems. To ancient authors, mercury was mysterious, fluid, reflective, alive in motion. To modern engineers, rotating fluids are not mystical, they are functional. Used in gyroscopes, stabilization systems, energy storage. This does not mean ancient engineers built jet engines, but it suggests something else. They were describing technology using the only language they had. When modern scientists analyze these texts, they do not find equations, they find observation. Cause and effect, motion and response. The texts are not instructive manuals. They are eyewitness accounts. Descriptions from people standing on the ground, watching something they could not explain. This brings us to a critical distinction. Ancient people did not invent gods to explain technology. They used gods to explain experiences. When something descends from the sky, produces thunderous noise, radiates light and heat, and moves beyond human capability, language fails, meaning collapses into reverence. Across cultures, similar descriptions appear. Which brings us to the Middle East. In the Hebrew Bible, there's a book attributed to the prophet Ezekiel. It contains one of the most detailed and disturbing visions in all of religious literature. Ezekiel does not describe a god in human form. He describes a structure. He describes wheels, but not ordinary wheels. Wheels within wheels, intersecting, rotating, moving independently of one another. He describes these wheels as shining, metallic, alive with motion. He describes eyes covering them, a strange detail. Until one considers that ancient language had no word for sensors, or ports, or openings. What Ezekiel describes is not a chariot. Chariots do not hover. They do not move vertically. They do not emit light. Ezekiel describes something descending from the sky with thunderous sound. A storm of fire and brightness, a platform, a structure, and above it, beings clothed in radiant material. Ezekiel's reaction is telling. He collapses. He is terrified. This is not the response of someone witnessing a gentle vision. It is the response of someone overwhelmed. Disoriented, afraid, he describes heat, noise, motion. He does not understand what he is seeing. And he does not try to explain it. He only describes it. Over and over again, scholars have tried to spiritualize this vision, to turn mechanics into metaphor, but the text resists simplification. Because Ezekiel is consistent, he does not say like a wheel. He says it was a wheel. He does not say as if it moved. He says it moved. In multiple directions, without turning. This is a strange thing to invent, especially for someone with no concept of advanced machinery. The similarities between Ezekiel's vision and descriptions from other ancient cultures are difficult to ignore. Descent from the sky, noise, light, heat. Entities that instruct, command, and then depart. Not spirits drifting through dreams, but encounters, physical, disruptive. Across time, humans have described divine encounters using the same sensory language. Sound, motion, brightness, these are not theological traits. They are physical ones. Again, we are not claiming these accounts describe visitors from elsewhere. We are not assigning origin. We are examining patterns. Patterns that suggest ancient people were witnessing technology through a pre-scientific lens. When a smartphone is shown to an isolated tribe today, they do not describe microprocessors, they describe magic. When helicopters were first encountered in remote regions, they were described as dragons. The human mind fills gaps with metaphor. But the underlying observation remains intact. The machine still flies. The machine still roars. the machine still leaves. This raises a troubling possibility. What if gods, as described in ancient texts, were not supernatural beings, but misunderstood agents, not necessarily creators, not necessarily owners, but operators, messengers, visitors? Even this interpretation requires caution, because influence does not require presence. Technology can be inherited, knowledge can be passed down. It is possible that ancient humans encountered remnants of advanced systems, or technologies left behind, or observed phenomena they could not control. What matters is not the conclusion. It is the consistency. Vimanas in India, wheels in Ezekiel. Different cultures, different religions, similar descriptions. Descriptions that sound uncomfortably mechanical. The question then becomes unavoidable. If these were machines, who built them? And perhaps more importantly, why did the descriptions stop? At some point, the gods fall silent, the machines disappear. The texts turn inward. Religion becomes moral, spiritual, abstract. The mechanical language fades, which suggests not evolution, but loss, because when technology vanishes, memory becomes myth, and myth becomes doctrine. Over time, what was once observed becomes believed, and belief no longer requires evidence, only faith. This transition is critical, because it marks the moment when history becomes theology. And theology stops asking questions, but we are allowed to ask. We must ask. Not to disprove belief, but to understand experience. Because ancient texts were not written for us. They were written by people trying to make sense of a world that occasionally behaved in ways they could not explain. If we read these texts as metaphor alone, we risk missing their informational value. If we read them literally, we risk oversimplification. But if we read them as records of observation, something else emerges. A picture of humanity encountering forces beyond its understanding. Forces that inspired awe, fear, obedience, and worship. Whether those forces were natural, technological, or something else entirely, remains unanswered, but the descriptions remain, unchanged, waiting. The gods of the ancient world may not have been what we think. Not omnipotent creators, not abstract spirits, but interpretable phenomena, events, machines, or agents operating machines. Descriptions that sound uncomfortably mechanical, because they were describing mechanics. And this realization leads us to the next question. If ancient humans were describing technology as divinity, then what else in the ancient world might have been misunderstood in the same way? Because once the line between God and machine begins to blur, history itself becomes unstable. And the story we tell about our past can no longer remain intact. This is where belief gives way to investigation, and where mythology becomes data, raw, unfiltered, uncomfortable. And we are only just beginning to read it that way. History often frames human progress as a straight line, trial, error, improvement. But anthropology tells a different story. Human development is uneven. Capabilities appear suddenly, then disappear. Techniques emerge without clear precursors. Ideas surface fully formed. And sometimes, the speed of change is difficult to explain through gradual evolution alone. This does not require external intervention, but it does raise a quieter question. What if guidance does not always announce itself? What if influence can occur without ownership? What if knowledge can be nudged rather than handed down? Anthropologists have long studied moments in history where societies shift rapidly. New laws, new belief systems, new technologies. Often these shifts are attributed to charismatic leaders, prophets, reformers, kings. But when examined closely, many of these figures share something unusual. They emerge suddenly, they change everything, and then they vanish. One such figure stands at the foundation of Western civilization: Moses. According to tradition, Moses leads a displaced population out of Egypt. A mass migration across hostile terrain, desert, scarcity. And yet, the story insists that this group survives for decades, not years, decades. Anthropologically, this is problematic. Nomadic survival at that scale requires logistics, water sources, food production, sanitation. The text offers a solution: manna, a substance described as appearing regularly, nutritious enough to sustain an entire population, predictable, reliable, but not natural in the usual sense. The descriptions are strange. Manna appears with the morning dew. It melts in heat. It spoils if stored improperly, except on specific days. This is not how wild food sources behave. Anthropologists usually explain manna as a metaphor or as a natural phenomena: resin, insects, fungi. But none of these explanations account for consistency, scale, or duration. 40 years is not symbolic in anthropological terms. It represents a full generational cycle. Children born into a system of dependency, raised within it, never knowing an alternative. What matters here is not whether manna was miraculous. It is that the narrative describes a sustained system. A system that requires regulation, rules, timing, compliance. Manna was not just food, it was control, behavioral conditioning, collection limits, rest days, penalties for deviation. From an anthropological perspective, this resembles resource management, a centralized system distributing sustenance. Whether symbolic or literal, the story encodes structure. And structure implies organization. The text also describes another object: the Ark of the Covenant, often interpreted purely as a religious artifact, but its behavior in the narrative is unusual. It emits power. People approach it incorrectly and are harmed. Those who handle it without instruction fall ill. Symptoms include hair loss, skin damage, and sudden death. Anthropologists do not diagnose ancient texts, but they recognize patterns. Descriptions of taboo objects that produce physical harm often reflect real danger: toxicity, radiation, electrical discharge. Again, this does not prove advanced technology, but it challenges purely symbolic interpretations. If these stories encode warnings, then they preserve operational knowledge. Rules passed down not to explain why something is dangerous, but to ensure survival around it. Influence does not require ownership. Guidance can be subtle, which brings us back to Egypt. To another sudden shift: Akhenaten, a pharaoh who broke 3,000 years of religious continuity. Egypt had been polytheistic for centuries. Gods tied to nature, to cycles, to cosmic balance. Then Akhenaten appears, and everything changes. He abolishes the old gods, introduces a singular, abstract deity, not embodied, not anthropomorphic, a sun disk, radiating energy. Light without form. This is not typical religious evolution. Anthropologically, belief systems tend to accrete. They layer. They rarely erase themselves overnight. Yet Akhenaten did exactly that. He rewrote theology, art, language, political power, and perhaps most interestingly, representation. Egyptian rulers were always idealized, symmetrical, timeless, Akhenaten rejected this. He demanded realism. Depictions show him with elongated skull, narrow face, extended cranium, androgynous features. These were not caricatures, they were state-approved images. Propaganda. Anthropologists ask why. Why would a ruler undermine the divine perfection associated with kingship? Unless the image served another purpose. Some suggest medical explanations. Genetic disorders, hormonal imbalance. These theories are debated, but they fail to explain consistency. Akhenaten's children are depicted similarly, including Tutankhamun. Elongated skulls are not unique to Egypt. They appear across continents: Peru, Central Asia, Africa. Anthropologists explain this through cultural cranial deformation, a known practice. Heads bound in infancy to alter shape, usually associated with elite status. Identity, belonging, but this explanation raises another question. Why alter skulls at all? Cranial deformation does not increase intelligence. It does not improve health. It carries risk. And yet, cultures across the world practiced it independently, often among ruling classes, often associated with priesthood. Anthropology suggests imitation. Humans alter themselves to resemble what they revere. If a group believes power comes from a particular form, they emulate that form. This is not speculation, it is documented behavior. Body modification has always been symbolic, but symbolic of what? If elongated skulls represented divinity, where did that image originate? Why did unrelated cultures converge on the same modification? Influence does not require ownership. Guidance can be subtle. This brings us to the concept of elite transmission. Anthropologists note that knowledge rarely spreads evenly. It concentrates. Priests, kings, shamans. These figures mediate between the unknown and the everyday. They do not need to understand fully. They only need to maintain function. Ritual preserves process without explanation. Rules outlive understanding. This could explain many ancient practices: monument construction, astronomical alignment, agricultural timing. All could be guided initially, then ritualized. Once ritualized, they become sacred. Questioning them becomes taboo. This stabilizes society. But it also freezes innovation. If guidance disappears, ritual remains. But function degrades. This pattern appears repeatedly. Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Levant, Mesoamerica, sudden peaks, then decline. Anthropology does not require an external helper to explain this, but it allows for the possibility of contact, not domination, not control, but inspiration, catalysts, small interventions that redirect trajectories, a technique, an idea, a warning. Influence does not require ownership. Guidance can be subtle. Consider Moses again. He does not claim to be divine. He claims to receive instruction. He ascends mountains, returns with laws, rules that restructure society, hygiene, diet, behavior. Many of these laws make practical sense. Disease prevention, social cohesion, stability. Anthropologists recognize this as adaptive coding. Rules framed as divine to ensure compliance, but the source of those rules remains open. Did Moses invent them or transmit them? Similarly, Akhenaten claimed revelation, a voice, a truth revealed. Anthropology does not evaluate the truth of revelation. It evaluates impact. And the impact was radical, too radical. After Akhenaten's death, Egypt erased him, his temples destroyed, his name removed. This is not typical succession, it is suppression. Anthropologists recognize this as cultural rejection. A system rejecting a disruptive influence, perhaps because it destabilized power, perhaps because it exposed something that could not be controlled. And then there are the skulls. Modern analysis of some elongated skulls shows unusual features, not deformation marks. Different bone structure, different sutures. This does not mean non-human, but it does mean not all skulls fit known practices. Anthropology cautions against jumping to conclusions, but it also warns against ignoring anomalies. Anomalies drive understanding forward. They reveal where models fail. What if some elites were different? Not superior, not divine, just different. Different origin, different physiology, or different upbringing. And what if their difference became mythologized? Over time, stories simplify, details blur, difference becomes divinity, and divinity becomes doctrine. Anthropology calls this mythogenesis, the transformation of history into sacred narrative. Once complete, the original event is unrecoverable, only symbols remain. Moses becomes a prophet, Akhenaten becomes a heretic. Skulls become ritual, meaning dissolves, what remains is belief. But anthropology invites us to pause, to look beneath belief. Not to dismiss it, but to understand its origins. Influence does not require ownership. Guidance can be subtle. Perhaps humanity did not receive help in the way we imagine. No gifts, no blueprints, no overt intervention. Perhaps guidance came as constraints, rules, ideas, seeds planted in receptive moments. Enough to redirect a civilization, not enough to control it. This would explain why knowledge appears suddenly and disappears just as suddenly. It would explain why elites are different, why they are revered, and why their legacy is ambiguous. It would also explain why no evidence of domination exists. Because domination was never the goal. Influence leaves fewer traces. And that is what makes it so difficult to detect. Anthropology does not ask who helped us. It asks how cultures change. And sometimes, the answer is not internal. Sometimes, cultures respond to stimuli they do not understand. They adapt. They encode. They ritualize. And when the stimulus vanishes, they continue performing the ritual until it no longer works. Then collapse follows. This does not make humanity weak. It makes humanity human, responsive, adaptive, imitative, and capable of building entire belief systems around moments of contact. Whether those moments involved other humans, lost cultures, or something else entirely, anthropology leaves that question open. Because the goal is not to replace belief with certainty. It is to replace certainty with curiosity. Influence does not require ownership. Guidance can be subtle. And the most profound changes in human history may have begun with a whisper, rather than a command, which leads us to the final question. If humanity was ever guided, why did that guidance stop? And more importantly, what happens if it returns, or if it never left at all? Those are not questions for theology, they are questions for us. And the answers may shape what comes next. For nearly an hour, we have avoided a word. Not because it is forbidden, but because it is too easy. Once that word is spoken, everything before it risks being dismissed. So we waited. We examined artifacts, texts, structures, systems, patterns of influence rather than control. We treated ancient testimony as anthropology, as observation, as human response to the unfamiliar. But eventually, every investigation reaches a point where avoidance becomes dishonest. Because if the patterns we've explored are even partially real, then a possibility emerges. Not a conclusion, a possibility. What if visitors were possible? Not gods, not saviors, not conquerors, just visitors. The idea itself is not radical. In fact, from a scientific perspective, it is increasingly mundane. The universe contains hundreds of billions of galaxies. Each galaxy holds hundreds of billions of stars. Many of those stars host planets. Modern astronomy has identified thousands of exoplanets, some within habitable zones, some older than Earth by billions of years. Time matters. If intelligent life arose elsewhere, even a fraction earlier than on Earth, the technological gap could be immense. This does not mean contact occurred, but it does mean contact is not impossible. And impossibility is the standard science requires, not comfort. If visitors were possible, then the real mystery isn't why they came, it's why they stopped. To explore that question, we must move forward in time, out of antiquity, into the modern world, into an era with radar, radio, cameras, and documentation. Because if something unusual was happening in the distant past, it should not vanish cleanly, traces should remain. And according to many accounts, they do. In July of 1947, something fell from the sky near Roswell, New Mexico. The location matters. Roswell was not remote wilderness. It was near a military installation. An installation connected to advanced weapons research. What was initially reported was straightforward. Debris recovered from a crash site. The local military base issued a press release. It stated that a flying disc had been recovered. This was not rumor, it was an official statement. Within hours, the story spread nationally. Then, just as quickly, it was retracted. The debris was reclassified. A weather balloon. Later, it became a high-altitude surveillance project. The explanation changed over time. That alone does not prove anything. Governments revise statements. Errors happen. But Roswell remains significant for a different reason. It marks the beginning of a pattern. Secrecy, contradiction, silence. Witnesses described materials unlike anything they recognized. Lightweight, extremely strong, memory-retentive metal. Again, these descriptions are not proof, but they are consistent. Decades later, similar materials would be researched openly. What makes Roswell uncomfortable is not the crash itself, it's the response. The speed of containment, the abrupt shift in narrative, and the enduring reluctance to discuss it transparently. Even today, Roswell remains unresolved, not confirmed, not debunked. Suspended. If something extraordinary occurred, it was buried. If nothing extraordinary occurred, the reaction was disproportionate. Either way, Roswell signals a turning point. From that moment on, the possibility of visitors entered public consciousness. Not through myth, through bureaucracy. And from there, reports multiply. Sightings, encounters, anomalies. Most are easily explained. Aircraft, atmospheric phenomena, human error. But not all, which brings us to a place far older than Roswell. A region that predates radar, predates flight, predates modern technology entirely, the Bermuda Triangle. For decades, the Bermuda Triangle has occupied a strange position in popular culture. Sensationalized, mocked, dismissed. But stripped of exaggeration, the region does present anomalies. Ships disappearing without distress signals, aircraft losing navigation, compasses behaving erratically, time discrepancies reported by pilots. Most incidents can be explained individually: weather, human error, magnetic variation. But anthropology teaches us to look for patterns, not exceptions, and the pattern here is persistence. Reports stretch back centuries. Long before modern myth-making, Christopher Columbus recorded strange lights over the ocean, unusual compass behavior. Modern pilots report similar phenomena: electronic failure, disorientation. In rare cases, what feels like time distortion, this is not evidence of visitors, but it is evidence of something unusual. Something environmental, geological, electromagnetic. The Earth itself is not uniform. It contains regions of intense magnetic activity. Anomalies in the crust, subsurface structures. Energy behaves differently in such areas. And where instruments fail, perception dominates. Human beings interpret confusion through culture. Ancient sailors spoke of monsters. Modern pilots speak of anomalies. The language changes. The experience remains. Now comes the uncomfortable intersection. If there were visitors, they would not need to land everywhere. They would not need to announce themselves. They would choose specific locations. Stable, energetically favorable, geographically strategic. Places where the environment itself assists their movement, their arrival, or their departure. Bermuda is one such place. Not because it is mystical, but because it is unstable. The same instability that disrupts human technology could facilitate non-human transit. This is speculation, but it is grounded speculation. Physics allows for natural anomalies. Wormholes are theoretical. But space-time distortion is real. Gravity bends space. Magnetic fields influence particles. Energy concentrates unevenly. None of this requires science fiction, only scale. What if ancient people encountered phenomena they could not explain? In these same regions, what if what we now call anomalies were once interpreted as divine movement? Again, the question is not proof. It is continuity. If contact occurred in the past, why does it appear to diminish over time? Why do accounts become rarer, vaguer, more disputed? This is where the narrative becomes uncomfortable, because there are only a few possibilities. 1. Visitors never existed. Everything is coincidence, misunderstanding, and myth. 2. Visitors existed and left permanently. 3. Visitors exist and changed strategy. Anthropology suggests that contact between unequal cultures follows patterns. Initial engagement, observation, limited interaction, withdrawal. Rarely does it involve permanent presence. Intervention creates dependency. Dependency creates instability. Advanced societies understand this. Human history demonstrates it repeatedly. Colonial contact often devastated indigenous cultures. Disease, disruption, collapse. If a non-human intelligence were cautious, it would minimize interference. It would observe, influence subtly, then retreat. Influence does not require ownership. Guidance can be subtle. This principle scales. Perhaps early human societies were nudged, ideas introduced, behaviors shaped. Not because humanity was incapable, but because timing mattered. Once humanity reached a certain threshold, the experiment ended, or the observation phase concluded. This is speculation, but it fits the data better than invasion narratives. It explains absence. It explains silence. It explains why ancient accounts feel intimate, while modern encounters feel distant. Lights in the sky, brief sightings, no dialogue, no instruction. Just presence, then nothing, if visitors were possible. Then the real mystery isn't why they came, it's why they stopped. Or why they changed, or why we no longer recognize what we are seeing. Because modern humans expect spectacle. Ancient humans expected meaning. We look for proof. They looked for interpretation. Perhaps the phenomena never left. Perhaps we simply lost the language to perceive it. Or perhaps the window closed. Civilizations mature. Awareness changes. What once required guidance no longer does. Or perhaps humanity failed a test. Not of intelligence, but of restraint. We weaponized knowledge. We centralized power. We exploited resources without balance. If influence was conditional, it may have been withdrawn. Not in anger, in caution. These are not comforting thoughts. They do not flatter humanity. They do not offer salvation. They offer responsibility. Because the final uncomfortable possibility is this: if visitors existed, and if they left, then whatever comes next comes from us. No guidance, no correction, no subtle nudges, just consequence. That may be the most human story of all, and it reframes everything we've explored: the artifacts, the myths, the structures, the sudden leaps, not as gifts, but as moments of opportunity, moments humanity may or may not have understood. And now, as we look outward into the cosmos ourselves, sending probes, listening for signals, searching for others, we may be asking the wrong question. Not are we alone, but are we ready? Because contact is not just about discovery, it is about maturity. And if the past teaches us anything, it is that influence does not require ownership. Guidance can be subtle, and silence may itself be an answer. By now, the question has changed. It is no longer about gods, or visitors, or lost technologies. It is about us. Because when you strip away the speculation, the myths, the anomalies, what remains is a pattern that is deeply human. Civilizations rise. They reach moments of extraordinary capability. And then, somehow they vanish. Not always in fire, not always in catastrophe. Sometimes, they simply fail to continue. We like to imagine progress as permanent, as a staircase that only moves upward. But history does not agree. History shows us long periods of stagnation, sudden leaps forward, and equally sudden collapses. Knowledge can be lost. Skills can disappear. Entire systems can be forgotten, not because they were impossible, but because they were no longer supported. Survival, not brilliance, determines what endures. The most advanced society is not remembered if it does not survive long enough to tell its story. Stone lasts longer than data. Myth lasts longer than instruction. Symbol outlives explanation, and so we inherit fragments. Artifacts without manuals, stories without context, structures without blueprints. We argue over what they mean, because meaning is all we have left. This is uncomfortable for a modern world that believes it is exceptional. We measure ourselves by technology, by speed, by reach, but history does not care how advanced you were, only whether you lasted. Consider our own civilization. We generate more information in a day than ancient societies produced in centuries, and yet that information is fragile, stored on systems that require constant energy, constant maintenance, constant stability. Remove those conditions, and it vanishes. The past does not disappear because it was simple. It disappears because it became unsustainable. This reframes everything we have explored. Perhaps ancient people did not lose knowledge. Because they were incapable, perhaps they lost it. Because the systems that supported it collapsed, perhaps what we call primitive is simply what remains after complexity fails. This is not a warning about aliens. It is a warning about ourselves. Because for the first time in history, humanity operates as a single interconnected system. Our energy, our food, our communication, our defense, all linked, all dependent, and therefore all vulnerable if something breaks its scale. There is no isolated collapse, only cascading failure. The past may not be a mystery. It may be a preview, not of what will happen, but of what can happen. We often ask whether we are alone in the universe. But perhaps the more important question is simpler. Are we durable? Can our civilization survive its own complexity? Can it outlive the systems it depends on? Because history is not written by the most advanced civilization. It is written by the one that survives. Everything else becomes archaeology. Everything else becomes myth. And one day, if we are not careful, so will we. Fade to black.